budget session got a shadow of history. And our budget session ended before schedule because some persons holding offices of profit had to be protected. And because Parliament was in session, an ordinance could not be passed. And therefore, this House lost valuable time in the budget session because the budget session was preponed and adjourned ahead of schedule. Thereafter, a political controversy with regard to resignations, by-elections, etc. took place. We then, at least we have the satisfaction on this side of having opposed this bill, approved this bill. And when we approved this bill, we were reminded by the highest constitutional authority of this land that probably what you have done is not constitutional. We are now choosing to overrule him. And while we are choosing to overrule him, we are not merely subverting the Constitution. There is certainly unrest on our side, even on the manner in which we are doing it. We were discussing a motion on the Mumbai blast yesterday. Today, for some reason, we decided to put that on the back burner and suddenly take up this bill. Why should this bill, what is so sacrosanct about today, the 27th of July, that this bill must be taken up in the Rajya Sabha today? Because 28th is Friday and it's not normally possible to do detailed legislative business. 29th and 30th will be Saturday and Sunday. Somehow this bill must be approved today itself, and that's the deadline, so that it can be approved by the Lok Sabha on the 31st. And what is the consequence of 31st? That the Election Commission has asked certain respondents, including one of the state governments, please give your response in relation to certain offices. The substance of this bill is that we are subverting the Constitution. The manner in which we are discussing it, we are subverting parliamentary procedures and giving a preference to self-interest of parliamentarians rather than the issue of terrorism, which we have chosen to put on the back burner, so that on the 31st, some of our colleagues in this house, as also the other house, can be saved. When I said that when we took it up on the 17th of May, it was an all-time low, today, sir, we are compounding the matter further. That somehow all other issues in the country, including a discussion on terrorism, can wait. But the right of parliamentarians to profit from offices conferred on them by the executive must be given priority. This certainly will not be a glorious moment for this House. Sir, at least my party has the satisfaction of having opposed this bill from its very inception. I remember in the earlier round in May, when I had given several reasons to oppose this bill, I was taunted by the other side that my arguments were laughable. I don't have the satisfaction today of the last laugh on view of what has happened in the last few months. But we all have this concern that what kind of an august body are we? We committed a constitutional blunder. We committed a constitutional monstrosity by bringing a legislation in the face of Article 102. We tried to exempt not offices, but our concern was to the holder of the offices who had to be protected. We were reminded by the highest constitutional authority that this requires reconsideration. Sir, never has this country seen such a disconnect between what the parliamentary majority is deciding and the will of the people. Sir, a few days ago, I saw on television, and television polls, let me concede, are not representative enough. Can President overrule Parliament? The question was framed in a manner where the answer should have been obvious no. But where are we taking our own credibility by legislations of this kind? 91% of the people on the television said yes, he should in a bill of this kind. That is the disconnect we are bringing between public opinion and what this House is deciding. And let us be very clear that there are not many occasions that we in parliamentary history get to correct the wrongs which we have committed. We repent over those wrongs, our future generations regret those wrongs. But this is a historic occasion where an opportunity has revisited us. An opportunity has revisited us to tell us that public opinion is against you, media opinion is against you, the opinion of the highest constitutional authority is against you, and all constitutional advice is against you. Please reconsider what you have done. I can understand, sir, for want of understanding of constitutional niceties, we may decide and commit a mistake once. I can understand, sir, that vested interest at times to save a government in power or a coalition may compel us to commit a mistake. But those who refuse to correct mistakes on being repeatedly told what are the mistakes you are committed, at times we wonder, why is this being done? Is it merely because of the arrogance of power that this is being done? We are in power, we have the numbers. And because we have the numbers, we are in a position to decide anything? Or is it being done because we refuse to see reason or rationality or logic, or lack the humility to give respect to another viewpoint, even if the viewpoint comes from the President of India? Sir, we committed a constitutional misadventure. A sage advice has come to us from the President of India. And to respond to that advice, it is the arrogance of parliamentary majority which tells us, how can he decide? Is he a rival center of power? Well, the President of India performs his constitutional duty. But then let me assure you, sir, Indian democracy is not so fragile. Indian democracy has many safeguards. And amongst those many safeguards that Indian democracy has, public opinion may be one, the right to vote out a government may be another. Those who all cheer you when you walk to power are the ones who will be looking at you when you walk down from power. And only history will decide whether you have the last laugh or those people who are watching you have the last laugh. And the government today is so intoxicated with that arrogance that it is not thinking in terms of what those people who will watch them when they walk down from power are going to think. Parliamentary majorities are not immortal. The right to remain in power is not immortal. It gets shaken. With the kind of public opinion, media opinion, constitutional opinion that has been passed, I have not the least doubt that the time is not far away that this law will also be subjected to strict judicial scrutiny. And if it is held to be violating many a constitutional provisions, it may become very difficult to sustain such a provision. So I recollect in the last session, we had supported the government on the amendments to the municipal law. Even at that time, we have cautioned them that there is a presumption of a validity of law, but don't enact laws which are so fragile that which will fail in scrutiny sooner than later. Don't be under this arrogance that we are the sovereign and therefore we have all powers. There are parliaments in the world which have complete parliamentary sovereignty and they can decide anything. But the sovereignty of Indian Parliament is conditioned in matters of legislation on two grounds. The first is the Indian Parliament does not have absolute sovereignty. The Indian Parliament sovereignty is subject to the legislative competence of the Parliament. It can legislate only in matters where it is competent to legislate. What falls within the purview of the state legislatures, we are not the sovereign. And the second restraint we have is, we can't legislate on a subject where we violate constitutional provisions. And if we violate constitutional provisions, our right to legislate is therefore conditioned by that limitation. And that is why all our legislations have to stand at times the test of judicial scrutiny. That's how our democracy is made of. Why did we, sir, earlier, and why do we now oppose this bill? Let us look at this bill. The very basis of Article 102 has been that our constitution is made on the premise of separation of powers. The executive performs its functions, the legislature performs its functions, the judiciary does its own functions. All the three wings function independently. The executive is accountable to the legislature. And when the executive is accountable to the legislature, to maintain the independence and dignity of the legislature, Article 102 was brought into the Constitution. The executive can't confer benefits on you. If you are profiteering from the executive, if you are beholden to the executive, you lose your independence in the matter of the executive being accountable to you. And therefore the Constitution very clearly said that whoever occupies an office of profit gets disqualified the moment he holds such an office. The holding of such an office was itself a disqualification. We are now creating a large number of offices as far as the union is concerned, where you continue to hold those offices. Whatever we do now here will be replicated by all the states. So you will have hundreds and hundreds, it could be in thousands of offices all over the country, which would be in the category of exempted offices. And effect of these exempted offices will be that the legislative bodies and their independence will be controlled by the executive, because there will be thousands of legislators all over the country, by such amendments, retrospective or prospective, who would be given benefits and offices by the executive, and therefore their independence and dignity to question the executive when it is accountable to them itself goes down. This bill in its spirit and its letter goes against what is in Article 102. But what is particularly disturbing is two facts. While deciding on this bill, we decide to give benefits to certain offices, the exemption benefits. And when we choose these offices, what is the criteria? What was the intention of the framers of the Constitution? The intention of the framers of the Constitution was that if there is any particular office, it may be an office of profit, but the office requires by its very character that a member of the legislative body should occupy that office. Then such an office would be considered an exempted office. So the exempted office and its character must have some nexus to the functions the individual has to perform. Therefore, conventionally, the offices we put into place were ministers, state ministers, deputy ministers, because they necessarily have to be MPs and MLAs. Then came a situation where benefits were being conferred on the leader of opposition, on chief whips of parties, on deputy whips of parties. So we included them to say, let leaders of opposition, chief whips, etc. will all be MPs and MLAs. They should be conferred benefits. I can understand outside the legislature there could be some extraordinary offices where an individual's experience as an MP or an MLA may be of great use. If such office comes up, the Constitution envisaged in Article 102 that such office could be put in the exempted category. And this, sir, is the principal ground on which My party and I believe, and most of us on this side believe, that this law is completely vulnerable. How did you decide the exemption? You did not decide the exemption on the basis that these are offices where MPs are necessarily required, so exempt them. The requirement of the office is such that an MP's experience will be of great utility. You decided this criteria on the basis a large number of our colleagues at present are in violation of Article 102. They stand to lose their membership, and therefore let us amend the law and let us protect these defaulters as of today. So the nexus of this list of exempted offices is not to the requirement of the office. It is to the holder of the office for whom a privilege is being created. I want to save the present holder of the office because the stability of my government depends on his support, and therefore, depending on who the holder of this office is, I will exempt him. Was this the object of Article 102? That exemption will have nexus to the holder of the office and not to the requirements of the office? If on such colorable exercise of power, we start legislating, and then we say, well, I am sovereign, who is the president to tell us rethink? Why should courts interfere in all these matters? Then certainly if we choose to violate the Constitution, somebody has to just knock at our doors and remind us that yes, Parliament is sovereign and supreme in functions which it has authority in. But over and above the Parliament, besides the people of India, there is the Constitution of India. And therefore the mandate of this Parliament may include amendment of the Constitution except its basic structure. The mandate of this Parliament does not include violation of that Constitution. And therefore, if the Parliament chooses to violate the Constitution by first create wholesale exemptions, then create a list of exempted offices whose nexus is not to the requirements of the office, but the nexus is to the holder of the office, then certainly, Mr. Chairman, this law is something which should shake the conscience of every Indian. And that is why in poll after poll, overwhelming majority people say Parliament's rights on this should be constrained. This is an extraneous debate. We don't accept that debate. But it's an extraneous debate which has started. And then what do? We not only make sure we exempt these offices, we give everybody a wholesale exemption since 1992. Since 1959. I'm sorry. Now, offices are created in the year 2004, in 1993, 1989, but the exemption is with effect from 1959. That's the drafting of this bill. So the President rightly says, how are you exempting offices prior to the date of birth of that office? Why are you doing that? And we say, sorry, we are in majority, so we are entitled to do that. We will just reconsider and say that we want this bill back. This, sir, is the dilemma that we face today. Let us pick up each of these 55 offices sought to be exempted by this bill. Next to the name of each office, you can write the name of the individual who is sought to be exempted. If it is simply put, as my colleague Sushma ji said the other day, ये पद नहीं है जिनको छोड़ा जा रहा है, हर पद के पीछे एक चेहरा है, उस चेहरे को बचाया जा रहा है. That in its essence is this bill. And we are wanting to exempt this, create an exemption of this kind by exonerating people who have violated the law. Now let us see the dichotomous situation which comes up. There are offices which exist. Let me give an example. Development authority. Now every city, every district, every township has a development authority. You have the Delhi Development Authority, you may have the Kanpur Development Authority, Jaipur Development Authority. So if development authorities require MPs as chairman, then all development authorities should be exempted. But we don't exempt all. We only exempt those development authorities where MPs as of today are chairpersons. we only exempt those offices. Why should the Jaipur and the Ahmedabad and the Mumbai Development Authority not be exempted? Why should only Haldia and Shantiniketan be exempted? For the simple reason, the current violators are the ones who are sought to be exempted. And by exempting current violators, the government decides to use its majority to prolong its own longevity so that its own supporters don't get disqualified under 102. And to prolong its own longevity, it decides to exempt those people. But then another dichotomy comes in. There are offices created which you occupy. There are offices which are created if you occupy. You are exempted from disqualification from the Union Parliament. But for the same offices, you are not disqualified. You are not protected if you are a member of a legislative assembly. Now there could be, like let us see, Indian Institute of Psychometry, All India Council of Sports. Now these are offices which Parliament has treated as exempted offices, but the Andhra Pradesh legislature has not treated them as exempted offices. So if you occupied these offices and were an MLA in Andhra Pradesh, you will get disqualified. But if you are a member of Parliament, you don't get disqualified. So the President then rightly says, are we having some uniformity in this matter or not? Or is it an arbitrary pick and choose that only my current supporters are to be exempted and therefore I will abuse the legislative power and using my majority have a legislation of this kind? So it is on this reason that we decided to oppose this bill. What does the President now remind us of? The parliamentary bulletin indicates some of the reasons why the President, and I'm presuming that the reasons which are to be specifically addressed are the ones which the President has reminded us of. The first reason he says is, why should there not be a comprehensive criteria for the whole country? Now I can quite understand the need for a comprehensive criteria. I read my friend Sitaram Yechuri's article in today's newspaper. Bharadwaj ji just now said the same thing. Office of profit has not been defined. Who prevented you from bringing a legislation defining the office of profit?
Even now they can better.
Office of profit was not defined by the legislature, but office of profit has been interpreted in dozens of judgments by the Supreme Court. Today there is no ambiguity as to what the definition is. But if some of us are confused, let us not just give irrelevant and irrational reasons. Then your bill should have said, my bill merely is for the centre and the states. In Article 191 and in Article 102, we give a uniform definition of the office of profit. You could have addressed the concern of the President by saying that there is a reasonable rational criteria all across the country where Article 102 and Article 191 give the same definition for the centre and the state of an office of profit. Now don't tell us in your opening comments there is a need to define it. Mr. Yechuri has very forcefully argued in today's article there is a need. Because there is no definition, there is a need. But your bill doesn't define it. The bill is only an arbitrary selection of posts depending on my list of supporters today so that I can exempt them. The second reason is, and this besides being questionable and colorable, is morally improper. What is morally improper can never be legislatively proper. Persons against whom petitions are pending, persons who have already violated the Constitution. And what does 102 say? You stand disqualified when you hold an office of profit. The disqualification of these members took place on the day that they held office. The first day that they entered this office, the disqualification has already occurred. If any one of them disputes it, it's only then that in Article 103 the Election Commission will make a formal declaration and President will act accordingly. So the second objection of the President is that disqualifications have already occurred. These offices should stand vacated. Petitions are pending under 103 for declaring them as vacant. You now step in and say I will retrospectively exonerate them by retrospectively changing the law. Sir, retrospective legislation, you use Kanta Kathuria's case to justify. I think time will come where even that view will have to be re-examined and revisited. But retrospective changes do not correct moral wrongs. When you corrected the law retrospectively in 1975, the election law, you scored a technical win, but you suffered a great moral defeat because you had to resort to that kind of an amendment by a retrospective legislation in 1975 to score a technical victory in validating an invalid election. You are now trying to validate those who have ordinarily vacated office, who stand disqualified because they happen to be current members, and as a nice good fraternity we must support each other, so we will now help each other in retaining his membership. The third objection of the President is almost to the same effect, that how do you have a 1959 retrospectivity? States are using different criteria, center is using different criteria. Where are we moving towards, sir? Sir, it's an easy trap to fall in. And I can see this government falling into that easy trap. Even independent of the President guiding the government to come on track, we've held a series of consultations with the government. We told them that we are not going after somebody's blood. We don't want to destabilize the polity. If a wrong practice has come in and the wrong practice is to be undone, we advise the government that there are several ways of doing it. Even if you want to condone the past, are you willing, do you have the moral stature to say that this kind of a practice for the future should stop? Consult political parties and do it. Now, this is something which, without destabilizing the polity, we would have stood high up in public esteem. The government would have stood with its head pride that this was a bad practice. There was a bad practice continuing, that in a house of 70, you could have 65 ministers. This house and the Lok Sabha unanimously amended the constitution and said 15%. Anti-defection law was passed. We then amended it further to do away with the split. These are all constitutional reforms that various governments have done. And each constitutional reform has served the polity well. And this was an occasion to say that this kind of a practice is going on in the past. We want to stop this practice and we want to correct for the future. We suggested to the government, come out with some such proposal. Don't be under the pressure that we want to destabilize the government and we want 50 of them to go. We'll speak to you, we'll find a solution. We made positive suggestions. Sir, but I got an uneasy impression. What I have mentioned earlier, the arrogance of numbers adds to the arrogance of power. And these two arrogances taken together itself were so intoxicating that those in power refuse to see reason. And when you refuse to see reason, I can tell you what the consequences will be. The consequences will be that, one, I have said public opinion is against you. You are committing a moral wrong. When the highest constitutional authority is advising you to correct, the highest constitutional authority is not a usurper. He is the highest constitutional authority. And sir, my party believes, and I am willing for an open debate on this. I am sure there would be, since it's a grey area, there could be different opinions as far as this is concerned. What will happen now? Let us just see what the role of the President under our Constitution is. Under Article 79, the phrase Parliament is defined. And when Parliament is defined as not just the two houses of Parliament. Article 79 says, there shall be a Parliament for the Union which shall consist of the President and the two houses known respectively as the Council of States and the House of People. The president is an integral part of the parliament. The constitution so defines it. When we send the bill to the president for assent, there are several functions the president performs, and while performing each one of them, the president has to keep upmost in his mind the oath of affirmation of office that he takes under Article 60. And let me read that oath of affirmation. I, so and so, swear in either solemnly affirm or swear in the name of God that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of India and to the best of my ability preserve, protect and defend the Constitution and the law, and I will devote myself to the service and well-being of the people of India. The President is, to the best of his abilities, is duty-bound to preserve, protect and defend the Constitution. He has taken an oath. There are functions which the President under Article 74 performs. He is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. There are functions where he has to apply his own independent mind. Whom to invite to form the government is a function where he is not bound by the aid and advice. Whether the Prime Minister in office has lost majority or not is an independent function. Whether nobody has majority and I should dissolve the House is his constitutional function. And when we send a bill for affirmation to the President under Article 111, the Supreme Court says specifically, the President is not performing an executive function. The President performs a legislative function. In that legislative function that the President performs under Article 111, he has to make up his mind performing a legislative function whether he must give assent or whether he must refer it back. While deciding whether to give assent or refer it back, the President does not go by aid and advice. If he is to decide to give assent, he gives assent. He is entitled to consult various people. He can consult governments, he can consult parliamentarians, he can consult leaders, he can consult constitutional authorities. And for that legislative function, he can even undertake a constitutional consultation under Article 143. That's a job of the President. And then he can tender advice back and say, well, this is what I feel. But now the Parliament says, I refer it back. If it refers it back, the President will have to consider what to do. Because at the end of the day, the President will be bound to devote himself to any extent to preserve the Constitution. He cannot second time withhold consent. But while he, in the process of deciding to give consent, he would still be entitled to take all efforts to make the Prime Minister, to make the government see reason, to get the best constitutional advice, including from various authorities, including the constitutionally provided advice, and tell the government this is what it is. And finally, if the government says, sorry, we overrule everybody and every interpretation of the law, then the President will perform his duty under Article 111 of not withholding assent. But before he gives his ultimate assent, he should leave no stone unturned to protect the Constitution of India. That is the job of the President under Article 111, and that is when the President is true to his oath under Article 60. And sir, if the government still chooses to say that we want to go ahead, then sir, as I said earlier, not only will it be an all-time low for this Parliament, it will be an all-time low for Indian democracy and for the government itself. I can understand, sir. None of us in this House was born yesterday that we can't understand what's going on behind. We all understand the significance of why the debate on the Bombay blast has been deferred and the Office of Profit has come today. Because there is something significant about Monday. Monday is the 31st. The Election Commission wants replies by the 31st. And my friends in the left parties are not willing to give those replies, or their governments are not willing to give those replies by the 31st. And therefore, not only is the Constitution to be subverted, the parliamentary agenda is to be subverted. It's not a great day for Parliament, sir. And let me remind my friends in the left parties, it is not merely a dispute of definition, because this law doesn't give definition. If the government merely wanted definitions, as Mr. Yachuri has very forcefully argued today, we could sit with them and work out a definition common to Article 102 and 191. But the object is, let me protect the present defaulters. So every time I hear my friends in the left parties, I get one good feeling that I may be disagreeing with them, but from their ideological point of view, at least they try and put forward what they want to say. They forcefully argue, they preach, they pontificate. But then we expect them to be held by the standards which they have professed. They've always wanted to hold the moral high ground. But because 17 or 18 MPs are to be protected, Constitution should be subverted, parliamentary agenda should be subverted. For what? So that my MPs can have an office of profit? Sir, I'm sure my friends, Mr. Yachuri and his colleagues, are better scholars of Marxism than I am. But the little that I know was that the hallmark of all exploitation was profit and the desire for profit. This is what Marx had probably told the world. Today, sir, it's a matter of regret that the precondition for support is protect my office of profit. This is the opportunistic position to which left parties have reduced themselves to. And sir, if this is the sum and substance of this legislation, as I said, you could see visibly, and this was live democracy, where even when we participated in this debate, some of our colleagues were uneasy. Why are we saying postpone Bombay blast? And why are we agreeing to your ruling? We should protest. So we agreed to participate despite our protest in the matter. Because we didn't want to give up this opportunity when the President has asked for the House to reconsider, that we should not be accused of having ducked that debate. Constitutionally, ethically, politically and morally, the opposition, sir, is right. The government is in the wrong. I have no doubt that the arrogance of this government will compel it to approve this bill. The fragility of this government, which is dependent on the support of the left parties and these 55 office holders of profit, will compel it to support this bill. But I have not the least doubt, sir, that we have great faith in Indian democracy. When rulers decide to approve such legislations, people know how to deal with such rulers. We will at least have the satisfaction of having gone back as dissenters. We will hold our heads high enough. But I can assure those in government that the last laugh on this has still not been seen. And I have no doubt that this bill, even after passage, will have great difficulty in becoming a law. And if it did become a law, it will face a near impossibility in sustaining itself as a law. With these words, sir, I oppose this bill on behalf of my party.
Sri Abhishek Singhvi.
वो थे उनके प्रेजेंट थे they were present. Some of the man was present. Mr. Chairman, sir, I am grateful for this opportunity to respond. I have heard my friend in rapt attention, and despite the several fallacies of his argument, each of his points requires very specific response. The Office of Profit has acquired an acronym OOP, which is perhaps reflective of the chaos and the confusion. If you pronounce that acronym OOP, the chaos and confusion is inherent in that acronym itself. But my friends on the opposite side are obviously trying to contribute more and more to that chaos and confusion. from a discussion of a bill on the office of profit. They have repeatedly tried to convert it to a discussion on a bill of perplexity and pandemonium. But may I deal with the issues on three fronts. My friend challenged the manner in which this House is proposing to deal with this subject and to pass or not pass the bill. And he then dealt with the merits of the matter. So may I firstly start with the manner of passing of this bill. My friend referred to it being a bad day for Parliament. I asked him and his supporters, is it very glorious for you to have participated through no less than the leader of the opposition in meetings which pre-decided that the office of profit bill will be taken up sometime today, and then to renege on a commitment which your party's senior representative had made along with others? Is it fair and glorious for you to draw the equation in an either-or format, either terrorism or office of profit, where there is no mutual exclusivity between the two? There is no question of both not being important. There is no question of this House not discussing both. You heard the minister a short while ago saying that we shall sit as late as we like to discuss terror, which of course, as you know well, has been discussed yesterday in some detail. Therefore, where is the question of either or? Where is the question of a choice? Both as parliamentarians, as commonsensical citizens and as lawyers, we know that there is nothing sacrosanct about 31st. If the Election Commission is given time 5, 7, 10 times earlier, it is entitled in its own discretion to give time. And I don't think they are going to consult you before they give or do not give time. So why do you interpose this hypothetical situation, create a red herring that this House wants to discuss this now to prevent something happening on 31st or to have something happening on 31st? The date of 31st, my friends will permit. I am sure if you have the, I am sure that if you have, I am sure if you have had the patience to hear to your party member, you will have the courage to listen to a different viewpoint. I am sure that you subscribe to Voltaire's view as parliamentarians, that you disagree with me vehemently, but will support my right to speak, and to speak in patience without interruption, if I may respectfully say so. As just a few moments ago we did when the honourable member from your party was speaking. Now you talk of the manner of passing of this bill. Is it very glorious for you not to follow and not to support a repeated ruling of the chair? That perhaps is your idea of parliamentary democracy. Not to follow a ruling of the chair, to obstruct the House or to walk out on other issues, when both terror and office of profit are liable to be discussed today and shall be discussed today,
बोलने दीजिए ना उनको,
प्लीज
बोलने दीजिए आप बोलने दीजिए, क्यों बीच में
मैं उन्हीं मुद्दों पे बोल रहा हूँ,
आप बोलिए।
एक उसी मुद्दे पे बोल रहा हूँ जिस मुद्दों पे माननीय मेंबर ने अभी बोला था आपकी तरफ से। मैं एक मुद्दा भी बाहर से नहीं ले रहा हूँ। So therefore, do not try to mislead the public or the nation about the manner. The manner is the only democratic manner of passing it. On the contrary, if I may say so, you are responsible for obstructing the House, for delaying proceedings, for taking up valuable parliamentary time and painting a picture of an either-or situation where none exists. Coming now to the second issue which has been involved, and that is the issue of parliamentary passage of a bill, presidential assent or non-assent, and the entire procedure of Article 111. My friend, to whom I listened with rapt attention, unfortunately is guilty of fallacy upon fallacy. And let me list you a few of the fallacies and then deal with them one by one. His first fallacy is implicitly right through his address that Parliament does something wrong if it even dares to discuss a matter and then to pass a bill which has been returned to Parliament by the President. That is the implicit theme of his address, that in doing so, Parliament is doing something unconstitutional, Parliament is doing something wrong, Parliament is doing something erroneous. The second fallacy, that's implicit in what you said.
Don't answer an argument I have not addressed.
That is implicit in what you said because you are painting a picture of Parliament versus the President, which is precisely what the equation is not there. It is the same equation which you painted when you just said a moment ago, either office of profit or terrorism.
No, leave it. Mr. Vailar Ravi, please, Mr. Vailar Ravi, please.
Can I remind my learned friend?
Mr. Jaitley,
Can I remind my friend that it's the same equation
No,
of
he has
either or.
not intervened. Why? Please don't.
It's the same equation of either or which you are trying to paint in every situation. Third fallacy, the party in opposition will say that a bill is unconstitutional and that will make it unconstitutional. By definition, an unconstitutional bill should not be passed by Parliament. But why is it unconstitutional? Because you say so. Yes. As Alice in Wonderland said, something is wrong because I, Alice in Wonderland, say so. But what is unconstitutional about it? Let me remind the honourable member and his party that unfortunately for you and perhaps for us, the person or the entity which decides constitutionality is yet to come into the picture. And it comes into the picture not when a document is a bill, but when it becomes an act. And that entity is the Supreme Court of India. So let us wait for the Supreme Court of India to pronounce it unconstitutional or to validate it. Let us not give advance certifications in a self-serving manner and then say it is unconstitutional and then say we should not pass it. If this is so, then you would be deciding what, unfortunately for you, the Constitution is entrusted to the Supreme Court. The next fallacy, that there are limitations on parliamentary power, and as far as two limitations are concerned, I entirely agree with you. But unfortunately, you have smuggled in a third limitation. The two limitations are legislative competence, which is not an issue today. We are not transgressing or encroaching on any state power. The second limitation is that ultimately whatever Parliament passes will be held or not held to be constitutional by the courts. So there is a limitation of ex post facto judicial review. But let me remind the honourable member and the party he represents that there is no third limitation on parliamentary power. Article 111 is certainly not that third limitation. Presidential reference back is certainly not a third limitation. Article 79 is certainly not a third limitation. Indeed, my friend's arguments suggest a complete vote of no confidence in the House and the Parliament to which he belongs. It suggests a vote of no confidence in the very institution of Parliament. But let me remind you, merely because, for whatever reason, you happen to be one of the few parties in this House which has decided to oppose this bill, let not hard politics make bad convention, bad precedent, bad law. You are dragging the President and the office of the President into a political arena. In the last few days and weeks, I have heard with astonishment arguments why the President should not refer this bill for advisory jurisdiction to the Supreme Court. I have heard with astonishment arguments that the President can or should override Parliament. It was the topic of a television debate. I have heard issues as to whether the President can delay such matters. Why are these issues being raised? These issues are being raised because you have deliberately misled the nation and this House on the meaning and scope of Article 111, with which I wish to start. Now it's interesting that if you'd done your constitutional homework, you would have emphasized the last 5 words of this article. And the last 5 words of this article are so unusual as not to be found virtually in any provision of the Constitution, virtually in any other constitution of the world. Those words are, if I may remind you, and I'm sure you haven't forgotten, but you have conveniently overlooked them in your addresses. The President shall not withhold assent. Surely, We, you, the House, the President, the nation is bound by the words of this small book which we call the Constitution of India. And let me remind you of another part of your constitutional homework. These very 5 words were missing in the draft article which came for approval before the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly, prior to Article 111, had before it Article 76. And if you read the books on this, you will find that Article 76 in its original form did not have these crucial words. A debate arose, an issue was joined, and it was said that ultimately in this country, for right or wrong, for good or bad, we have adopted a constitutional system of parliamentary democracy under which, barring 2 or 3 exceptional situations, the President of India follows the system of a constitutional entity and does not rule but reigns. He follows by 400-year precedents broadly the contours of the status of the Queen of England. And therefore, after the article did not have these words after discussion were inserted. What does that mean? For you it means that you are guilty just now of advocating a deliberate violation by this House of presidential of the intent of the framers. You want to violate the spirit and letter of the intent of those who framed this Constitution. The third aspect of Article 111. Article 111 represents the dialectics, the constitutional dialectics of give and take. In the Marxian terms, it represents the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. That's a Marxian dialectic. But there is a dialectic in this constitutional process also. The Constitution envisages, knows, accepts all along that there may be situations where the Parliament and the President may differ. It doesn't mean that either is wrong. It doesn't mean that either is right. It only means that each is a high constitutional functionary entitled to the highest respect, the highest reverence, and the highest consideration. But ultimately, for those who decide, the framers could not have left it as 2 disagreeing institutions. So having anticipated the potential disagreement between these 2 institutions, the framers created this mechanism and added a proviso to Article 111. And indeed the proviso did not have these words, but these words were added precisely to envisage the situation which you call immoral, wrong, and you suggest that the President, having spoken on it, this House cannot or should not debate it. The fact that I am debating this or that you are considering it is not the slightest disrespect to the highest holder of the executive office in this country. On the contrary, each and every concern of the President of India has been and must be taken into account. But will that attenuate or circumscribe the sovereign power of Parliament, which has been entrusted to this body by the Constitution itself? Because if you say so, then you express a vote of no confidence in Parliament, you express a vote of no confidence in the Constitution, you express a vote of no confidence in those who framed the Constitution and expressed this intent so clearly, so categorically. But let me continue into how you have dragged the President into this political arena. Very wrongly. You are aware that the President has a right to send it back for reconsideration. You are equally aware that we have a right to consider and then decide as per the wisdom of this House. The President chose to send it back. And let me say here that I totally disagree with your picture that the President, in sending it back, has written down that the bill is unconstitutional. That is completely misleading again. Please see the President's referral back. There is no question of assuming that the President thinks or says that he thinks that this is unconstitutional. But I will come to that in a moment. When the President sends it back, I'm glad you are using, I'm glad my friend is using such good words, because if you believe in those good words, you should not have dragged the President into the political arena. You should not have dragged the President into the political arena.
Mr. Jyoti, please. Mr. Jyoti, please.
The President sends it back on a referral. The referral is to be reconsidered by Parliament under this article of the Constitution. While the matter is pending in Parliament, while Parliament is seized of the matter, you choose to go public and you choose to go to the President to suggest various alternatives to the President, while the President, quite rightly in terms of the Constitution, has left it for the time being with Parliament. Is this glorious? Is this correct? Is this a following of the parliamentary procedure? Is this a adherence to high standards of public life or the constitutional spirit? You could as well have waited for Parliament to debate it. You tried to preempt. I heard with equal astonishment, utter amazement, your suggestion that the President can and should refer it to the Supreme Court. For this argument, you pressed into service the office of oath. There lies another fallacy. But that fallacy has very grave implications. The fallacy is your premise that the President is entitled under the Indian Constitution to be a judge of potential legislation by referring to his oath. Now forget this case for a minute, because we tend to become exacerbated and excited about the facts of a particular case. But please appreciate the implications of what you have said. If this is correct, then every proposal, every bill from Parliament can be judged by the President by reference to his oath. The President will decide by reference to his oath, according to you, not according to the President, that a bill is unconstitutional, violative of Part 3, or that it shockingly violates his oath, and therefore, having so decided, will not give assent. The Supreme Court is, of course, to become irrelevant. But more than that, there is absolutely no power in the Constitution, and the President rightly recognizes it, and all our presidents have rightly recognized it till now, but you don't recognize it, that the President has no power under the Constitution to refer and decide matters by reference to a third entity known as the oath. This will convert our parliamentary democracy, our constitutional ethos, our spirit of our Constitution into a totally different field. It will maybe convert it into a presidential system, partly of the US kind. It will maybe make it a hybrid which belongs to no species and no category. But it will certainly do violence to the very basis on which our constitutional structure is premised. So, your reference that the President should consider referring it to the Supreme Court is deliberate mischief. You are also equally aware of the fact that this question of what the President can or cannot do arose in several situations. And ultimately, 25 or 22 years from before today, way back in 74, is nothing new. It was decided even before 74, but it was conclusively settled to rest by the Indian Supreme Court that these questions of the President acting on his own under Article X and Y and being bound under Article A and B will arise frequently. It's a usual thing. And therefore, if it arises, we must definitively settle this issue and decide in what situations the President can act individually. And Shamsher Singh's case, way back in 1974, not 2, not 3, not 5, but 7 judges laid down the law of the land, which has withstood the test of time today after 22 years, and they said, barring the situation where the President may decide on his own in a dissolution case, or where the incumbent government has lost its majority, the President shall always act on the aid and advice of the Cabinet. And if that is so, where is the question of your going to the President or to the press and suggesting that the President suo motu and separately on his own shall approach the Supreme Court under whether Article 143 for advisory opinion or anything else? Now, to that, Article 79 is no answer. The answer you gave is irrelevant as far as the presidential power is concerned. Article 79 simply says that the President is part of the parliamentary process so far as passing of a bill is concerned. But that is axiomatic. It has been known to us since 12th century, when the British Queen was also treated as part of the Parliament, that the one or the two houses will pass a bill and the President or the Sovereign will assent to it. In that sense, they are part of a parliamentary process. But that does not mean, and no President has ever suggested that it means, and no one else has said that it means, that the President shall have individual discretion in respect of bills. So that again is highly mischievous and misleading. But let me remind you that you have not only raised this issue, but you have obstructed Parliament on this issue. You have sought to go to the public and the press by suggesting that referral of this matter to the Supreme Court by the President without the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers is permissible. And let me remind you also of more recent law, definitive law on this subject. You mentioned Article 79. completely irrelevant and unrelated to the subject. But let me remind you again of judgments which have drawn a very, very sharp distinction between the power of the President under 111 and the power of the President under some special provisions where he does have individual discretion. And that's a very interesting theme, which again makes the precise point which this government is seeking to make and this House should make. And that is this: the President under 111 can return. The last 4 words say that if it is returned back by the House, the President shall assent to it. This the Supreme Court, not me or you. I will not. I'm sorry.
He is not yielding.
You will have your turn.
Mr. Jyoti, your name is there. No, your name is there. You have patience. No, you have patience. Mr. Jyoti, no, Mr. Jyoti, no, I will not allow. Nothing goes on record what it is. Mr. Jyoti, Mr. Jyoti, you are speaking. No, you are speaking. You are going to, your name is there, then you can respond. Don't respond. Whatever it is his opinion. No, you cannot say that. You cannot say that. You have no right to say that.
My friend will.
No, that is all right. That is, you can also say, you can't say that.
My friend will do unto others. My friend will do unto others, including me, what he would have me do unto you. The Supreme Court has described the power of the President and the power of Parliament precisely under this very provision, 111, as compulsory assent. Compulsory assent, and if you want to check up the law, I don't want to get technical, it is by 5 judges. In 2002, in 2002,
no, Mr. Abhishek Singhi, you please don't respond to him. Please,
in 2002, 8 SCC 182. If you want the paragraph, it is 76 and 77.
You place your points, but don't respond to him.
And what did the Supreme Court say? No, I'm not responding to him. It said, and I quote, being an exercise pertaining to expression of political will, apparently the will of the people expressed through the legislation passed by the elected representatives is given prominence by specifically providing for compulsory assent or compulsory consent. But it did something more. In the next paragraph, it did something remarkable. It drew a distinction between other provisions where the President does have some discretion. For example, when a state legislation or a state law potentially may violate central law and it is reserved for the assent of the President under a different Article 254, the President would have a different approach and a different discretion. That makes the precise point that today, to draw the President into the arena, the political arena, by suggesting what? By suggesting that the President should refer for an expert opinion, the President can override Parliament, the President may delay, the President may refer to an oath. These are extraneous, irrelevant, misleading matters, and they do not deserve the attention of this Honorable August House. But let me go further and remind you that the House is ultimately the House which takes responsibility about the validity or otherwise of a bill. The House, when it passes any legislation, knows that it is ex post facto in future that the courts may or may not strike it down. The House cannot be deterred in advance by merely creating